Issues that are happening in the Dominican Republic. So we've convinced Rolando Gonzalez Boonster, one of our board members of the Institute of the Americas, who also happens to be a power generator in the Dominican Republic, to conclude our panel here, or at least the formal interventions of our panel, with some thoughts and perspectives from this third piece here, as we would like to call it, of this discussion of reshaping energy markets from North America across the hemisphere. And so we'll now turn to Rolando, and then a reminder, you've got these question cards. We'll circulate during Rolando's intervention to get these from you and give them to Charles to have a discussion. So I'll go ahead and hopefully your microphone's working, and turn it back over.
Thank you, Jeremy. First, I want to congratulate both Chris and Manuel for such a wonderful presentation. I think they hit it on the nail on what is the crux of the matter that we are facing today. In the particular case of the Dominican Republic, we have a situation that is evoked very well in their presentations, and that is that the Dominican Republic has, fortunately today, a gas terminal and has somewhat of a gas economy. As AES built back in the early 2000 a terminal and installed a 300 megawatt facility. Subsequent to that, they extended a pipeline to two other plants that they had that had been somewhat dormant for a while, and then there's about 500 megawatts in production today by AES on gas. There is also a substantial amount of gas being sold in the market. Unfortunately, AES, which in hindsight turned out to be a real genius, because when they built the terminal, they had forecast $2.50 gas, and unfortunately they went through the whole series of spikes that we saw on the charts, and as a result had some very bad years, and now fortunately they are being able to harvest the low prices and be very successful at generating at the lowest cost. In my particular case, I am an investor, our group is an investor in a series of power plants, one of them being a 300 megawatt combined cycle plant that should have been built right next to the AES terminal, but was built in the town of San Pedro by other people. And when we acquired it back in 1996, in 2006, our intention was to convert it to gas. And that is still our intention, especially now that gas is at such an enormous price differential with diesel oil or with heavy fuel oil. And that plant, we are in the process of developing either our own terminal or an expansion together maybe with AES in their own terminal, or building an FSRU in the vicinity of San Pedro de Macorís. We have partnered with BW Gas, which is a world-leading gas transportation company, who has now decided to go into the terminal. And I think Suez has an FSRU that is owned or installed by in Chile, in Mejillones. So the idea is to expand on the existing terminals in the Dominican Republic. The big motivating factor, as it was well presented by our previous speakers, is the differential that exists between number 6 oil or number 2 oil, which is the basis for most of the generation in the Dominican other than AES's, and the price of natural gas. We have been reaching agreements with Cheniere, and the idea is to, when they are in a position to export, is to bring natural gas to the Dominican Republic. And I think the formula that was presented, somewhere between $10 and $15, seems to be accurate, because depending on what the price will be when Cheniere goes in operation, if you look at the forward curve, gas is trading around $6 or $7. If you add all the additional cost between the processing fee of the terminal and the shipping and the processing fee of the receiving terminal, your gas price landed will be somewhere between $10 and $15. I think that was an accurate reflection. What is, in our particular case, what are we facing today is that if we generate with number 6 oil, the cost landed in the Dominican Republic is $20 a million BTUs, between 18 and 20, depending on what oil is doing. If you look at number 2 oil, for instance, this combined cycle plant that we own, the price there is over $25 a million BTUs. So it is essential for low-cost power or competitive power in the Caribbean region to be somewhere in between 10 and 15 and to be able to convert gas to kilowatts at around 7,500 BTUs per kilowatt hour. So that is what our objective is. So we have been sort of redesigning the wheel, trying to bring, create the terminal, the logistics to be able to receive the gas, convert the power plants that do exist today. And we have about 1,000 megawatts of power that could be converted. We are building, right now, one of our companies, E.G. Heine, is building a 220 megawatt facility that's going to be dual fuel. We have an existing 150 megawatt floating barge that runs on heavy fuel that will be converted to dual fuel. And then the 300 megawatt combined cycle suspend plant would be converted to dual fuel. So in bringing about 1,000 megawatts of new capacity to be converted to gas means that we could have about 1 million tons of LNG per year, which makes any terminal justifiable and economically possible. So we see the Caribbean, first of all, the Caribbean by itself individually may not be attractive, but if you create a terminal and you have the ability to export from that terminal, there are smaller islands around the Caribbean that become potentially very interesting markets. To give you an example, Grand Cayman has 150 megawatts of installed capacity operating on diesel fuel. They could, for very little money, convert to natural gas, and if they were able to receive natural gas at between $10 and $15, the cost of electricity would go down substantially, about close to 8 to 10 cents a kilowatt. That's an enormous savings for the island of Grand Cayman. Like Grand Cayman, you have Barbados, you have Jamaica, you have the Bahamas, you have Haiti, you have a whole series of islands that could benefit from the added or the improved situation with natural gas. As both the previous speakers mentioned, the whole question is, we've seen Henry Hub spike before, we've seen NYMEX become a very volatile market. It seems that for the first time with the shale production, for the foreseeable future, it seems that the U.S. will have overcapacity as long as it doesn't all go for exports. But given the analysis that I saw earlier, I feel more comfortable in saying that stability will probably prevail and markets should be more controlled. So, the essence of my reflection on what I saw before is that both the previous speakers presented a very compelling story for what could be the future of LNG and natural gas in the Caribbean. The question is getting the sustainability in the markets to justify people investing a lot of money in it. Because you do a terminal, pipelines, all these things cost money, and in small economies, you need the assurance that the markets can back the investment. So, I can only say that I look forward as a very challenging moment in our energy life to look at the future and see natural gas as a very, very compelling story.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rolando. I've got a handful of questions here, some of which I can actually read. I want to thank those of you who have good handwriting. Chris, let me start with you. Manuel talked about gas for transportation. And something that in your slides was not focused on as a major consumer of natural gas. Where do you see that going, particularly in North America?
Well, I mean, we see it progressing, but he pointed out something that's a very good point. We're not a world leader in this field. We could be.
I mean, Argentina already uses it.
Exactly,
right?
and many other
Colombia,
places.
Brazil, Peru,
Pakistan.
We have millions of cars already in Latin America
Absolutely.
running on gas.
There are many
Millions,
markets around the world that have embraced this technology. We're not one of them. And I think there may be some very good reasons why that's the case, despite all the, news and activity and the T-Boone Pickens, clean fuels and so forth. And that is just the sheer magnitude of the transportation sector in the U.S., the distances and the amount of investment that goes into the service stations. What we're projecting, and when you saw that, I didn't get into the details, but when you see that 1 BCFD number, and I just offer that over a longer term horizon, 2020, 2030, we see it getting up into the 4 or 5 BCFD. That is a small fraction of the market. And what that really represents is very selective conversion of heavy fleet vehicles that have a great economy of scale, switching from diesel to natural gas firing, LNG vehicles, long-haul trucking, where the infrastructure that's needed for fueling is either centralized location within a certain city or metropolitan area, or a major corridor and highway, sort of corridor where you can focus bite-sized amounts of investment in fueling infrastructure instead of trying to cover everything, because it's a big country.
Could I
Yes,
just a small caveat on that. Honda is, I think, the only importer of automobiles that's able to deliver to you a factory-built natural gas car. I saw an ad in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago, and I called up a dealer in Long Island that was selling them. And apparently they have them in a few states, but what he told me was that you could buy the car for about $25,000, and it cannot run on gasoline, but you could get some gadget that you put in your garage that takes natural gas off your heating system, and you can use it to sort of fill it up. So essentially, you could have gas at night when you park your car. Have you heard that?
I don't know that specific technology, but it sounds like some sort of compressor.
Yeah.
Is it a CNG vehicle? It must be. Yeah.
Yeah, probably CNG.
Yeah, this for anyone who wants to answer. With low natural gas prices, what opportunities have all the countries that are planning to begin shale gas exploitation? And what's going to happen with those projects that are losing money now?
The countries, I think Christina Kirchner destroyed a lot of the chances of getting people to invest in her shale there. But as far as the ability of what's happening in the shale, I think, and I may be, you may want to elaborate on that. It's that a lot of the shale people are looking for oil, and they get shale, and oil is expensive, and I mean they get shale oil also, or they get the gas that they extract the propane or the butane or the ethane, and it makes it profitable. So I think to a great degree that has been happening, and gas then becomes a cheap commodity.
So it's a byproduct,
Yeah.
essentially. There's been a great focus in the U.S., I assume elsewhere, about environmental concerns associated with shale gas exploitation, both the huge consumption of water necessary. I saw some articles the past couple of days about methane escaping directly in the atmosphere, so that it looks like shale gas is not as energy friendly as if you go from the wellhead, as if you only start measuring from the power plant. To what extent is that going to slow down shale gas revolution? I guess, Chris, I'll ask you.
Yeah, our view is currently, our views are always evolving, but our current view is that it's not so much a question of slowing down development, although there could be some areas where state level regulation has an impact on the speed of drilling and development, but it's more an issue of what's the cost of production. The two huge issues from an environmental perspective are wastewater treatment, the flowback water. It used to be, in recent years, everybody focused on the water going in and the fracking chemicals and all that, and it turned out to be not such a big issue. But what's much more an issue is the water that comes out with brine, metals, and various things that exist underground that come out and are not easy to treat for municipal water system treatment plants. So that's going to be additional capital costs, and we've analyzed those costs. They can be, we have scenarios around that. I mean, you can have a range of below 50 cents an MMBTU, 20, 30 cents, up to almost $1. Depends on which regulatory methodology and which technology you're analyzing. The other that you mentioned is now becoming, I think, also a very large issue, is fugitive methane, and the ability to measure, track, capture, and or flare in the case of some places where, as you mentioned, tie all these things together, gas is a byproduct. It literally doesn't have enough value to be worth capturing and using when you're in the play for the liquids and the oil and so forth, and it's getting flared. Flaring is an acceptable way of mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, but it would be far better to burn the gas for the generation of power or something else. So there's I think, new costs and new controls coming there. And the last one I'll mention, you didn't mention, is the well casings, which have a cost component as well that could be an adder. So we're focusing on the potential cost of production impacts from these regulations and concerns more than on any kind of sort of constraint or slowdown in the drilling that results. I mean, I guess the two are tied together, because if it costs more, you need to be able to earn that amount. But we think the market will just adjust quickly and reflect that in the prices, because it will have to.
Anything you'd like to add? What, Chris, this is for you again. I apologize. People have more time to respond to you, so you get more questions here. You referred to the Chinese slowdown as part of tomorrow's headlines in your analysis. What does the slowdown mean in this scenario? And what sort of growth rates, what would it have to slow down to have an impact?
Yeah, I wasn't being that precise about it, and I wasn't saying that it was tomorrow's headline, but there was a question mark on the horizon in the recent environment. I mean, there's already been some evidence that 9–10% growth rates for China are not going to be sustainable, and we're going to start seeing more 6, 7, 8 kind of range. But if it goes further than that, or if things that we don't, I mean, I guess we see now, but if they actually turn into a big problem, like the real estate bubble or the banking sector or something in China that right now is sort of muddling through or working okay, becomes an explosive issue, and we have a big bubble or some sort of meltdown, then you have a period of years where there's adjustment, correction. That could, a lot of the driver in the LNG business is the Chinese import story and the Indian import story. The Japanese import growth recently was very substantial growth, but very short-lived in the sense that they probably just reached the maximum, and the Japanese economy is not going to grow at that kind of a rate. So we've probably reached the end of that story recently, but it's really China and India that drive the future growth. So if they don't kind of meet those targets that the developers of liquefaction capacity have been expecting, the Australians, there's the Woodmac studies and others out there saying, China's going to quadruple its consumption of gas and things of that nature. If that doesn't materialize, then we have less demand more supply, softer prices. One other thing I didn't mention, I'll just throw in there as well, is the Chinese shale development initiative, which I think is quite serious and quite substantial. I've seen over the last couple of years at industry events like this, the Chinese delegations and the amount of people, attention, money being thrown at LNG has shifted, and really where a lot of the focus is now is on shale. So I think there's a pretty wholesale policy shift there, trying to bring on their own gas resources. It will take them some time. It's not going to be easy. But as that happens, of course, it has the same effect as economic slowdown, less demand for imported LNG.
Right. I want to thank whoever turned down the thermostat, turned off the cold air here in this meat locker. Manuel, this is for you. Can the LNG import models from Boston, the United States, and the Dominican Republic be the basis for LNG developments in Central America?
I think they're different scale. And perhaps Dominican Republic, after all, is a large island. Puerto Rico obviously is the biggest demand of LNG in the sub-region. Now the shuttle, he mentioned it, I mentioned it with different names. To develop that, you need to shuttle the gas from one place to another, and to have inventory. It's like for oil. When you have in different places, you have oil, you have a tank, you have a buoy or a jetty or something that brings the oil in, and then you have to adjust the frequency. It's relatively easy to have a big oil tank because it's at atmosphere temperature. This one doesn't need a special isolation. It needs a special protection. Our tank in Chile is horribly expensive because it needs to be resist a good shake, because there's always a tremor or earthquake or something like that. So this tank is much more expensive than the tank for diesel or fuel line number 6. And that's why we sometimes use a boat as a tank. And if the tank is difficult, it's not very different, the price of the boat, than the price of the tank on shore, except that the price on tank on shore, you can sort of, you have to decide to amortize that in 20 years, and it's much cheaper. But if you amortize that in 5 or 10 years, because the country, you don't know if the Henry Hub, etc., it's not too different to the boat just staying outside your harbor. And when we have a tsunami, we have had their boat in Chile, and when there was a tsunami in Japan, we had to send the boat out of the jetty just in case the tsunami arrived to Latin America. So you have some hours of disruption or days of disruption until the boat comes back because there's no more. So I think we will have to have protected harbors, smaller shuttles, than what we have normally in the industry today, and there's very little experience. There are only 2 experiences going on smaller shuttles and river boats, etc. So it's possible, but we have to have it's not going to be one player that puts that together. It's going to be 3 or 4 players. We have to have a midterm view of the Henry Hub and of the oil and the spread between the oil and the Henry Hub. You need at least $8 a million BTU of spread between your gas and your substitution oil to develop an industry. When you say, and that's what you're thinking about. You say, well, the gas could arrive between 10 and 15, and my consumption is between 20 or up to 25, and there you have that
a cushion.
Yeah. That at least you need that gap of $8 a million BTU to pay off all this logistics.
Good. Let's help. Chris, I can't resist this because it's such a juicy political question. How relevant would it be if there's a change in the White House, and the Republicans win in November, and you have a huge push for fossil fuels in the U.S., and more drilling and more coal and drilling in fragile environmental areas. How relevant would that be for, how do you see that playing out in terms of gas, in terms of other fossil fuels?
I need one more piece of information. What happens in Congress?
Okay, so just assume you continue with split Congress. Got Republicans in one house and Democrats in the other.
Irrelevant. Doesn't matter. I think a lot is about actually Congress in terms of whoever's in the White House, what they can get done, or whether it's just status quo and there's not a lot of development one way or the other. But taking the bait and going through the implications, I think. The first thing is, one of our scenarios for shale production costs relates to the drilling incentives that are in place now and are on deck to get repealed or removed. So there's a variety of drilling incentives that are applicable to shale gas production that would go away if the President and Congress act on this, and that would drive costs up because it would remove the incentives. That would not happen if Romney were in the White House, and if it almost certainly would not happen if the Congress was supportive. And I think he would. I'm not actually sure of his position on this, but I think he might veto it even if Congress was pushing it. So it's far less likely anyway. That would keep costs under control for shale gas. That's one of the key things. The other key thing I think is environmental. I mean, as everybody knows, the White House has been using the EPA to push through a variety of environmental initiatives while they sort of work on the political constellation and see if they can get back to kind of a climate policy again, maybe in the next administration. That's less likely, far less likely to proceed. I think there's a lot of pushback in the Republican Party about the regulation of environmental for oil and gas. And so the additional cost scenarios that I referred to earlier about the wastewater and the fugitive methane and so forth, I'm not saying they would go away. I believe the EPA will remain active. I believe they'll still be responsive on those issues, and there'll still be public policy or public pressure on those issues that they'll address. But the speed and the level of cost and the aggressiveness of the policy will be less. And so the cost implications will be less as well. I think overall, when you sort of work through all those kinds of issues, you come out with a view of, shale being easier to produce at a lower cost for a longer time and less kind of policy-driven cost impacts in shale.
Good. Rolando, how quickly will shale gas production react to price changes?
Well, I think a lot of the shale gas that exists in the United States, that the amounts that they're talking about are sort of in previous. They're not. The price is not really affecting it right now because of the ability that a lot of that shale production has subproducts with it. I think at $2 or $2.50 or $3, it's marginal. As I hear producers, they say that they need $5 to $6 to make money on just pure gas plays. I think everybody knows where they may cap wells and have less availability to store, but it seems to me that the availability and the enormous amount of shale gas available is, it's going to create low prices for a while. I don't see it really spiking.
Manuel, how do you see cheap gas affecting renewables?
Well, that's a good question.
Fortunately, although you said there is what we sometimes call some leak, already gas is a little bit carbon light. It's not carbon heavy, we say. That means per kilowatt it's half, or per megawatt is half a ton of CO2 and not 1 ton of CO2 in I would say in general. So it's not bad. Of course, you say there is some leak upstream of the power plant, and a leak or emissions upstream. So, but it's not it's not bad per se. It's relatively, natural gas is already below the grid emissions a lot of countries. For example, China, and so, or even so it's, that emission is better than the average emission that you have in a lot of countries.
Does it slow?
Not in Latin America, because we have a lot of hydro, but in countries where you don't have as much as hydro, the natural gas is already lower than the average emission.
Does it slow research into renewables, do you think? And conversion to renewables?
Okay, I think that the renewables will have some other issues, is the attitude of the economic slowdown on renewables. Some countries cannot pay, if you want, anymore the prices, because always renewable was more expensive than the fossil fuel energy. So it had a sort of a positive discrimination. And you paid more for it, but it was renewable. I think the economic slowdown has two reactions. Nobody wants to pay more for somebody or for something. Second, because there is an economic slowdown, naturally there's less emissions. So the urge for less emissions is lower. So I think it's higher, the impact of the slowdown than of the natural gas on other renewables. I don't know, Christopher, if you have...
I think that sounds about right. I do think
that
gas...
observation, at least that's a European observation. I don't know if it's a...
I think in the States, clearly, the low gas prices, with gas on the margin in the United States and being a very significant source of power generation, and those tremendously low gas prices, I mean, it's been pretty destructive for renewable development. Part of it, I would agree, part of it is the recession, and the lack of willingness to pay, some regulated price or for renewable energy that's substantially above, gas-fired generation. That evaporates in a tough economy, and so it's and incentives get pulled, and state budgets are in crisis, so the willingness to fund, subsidies and so forth is gone. So there's all those impacts.
Just for you to recall, in Europe, the typical price for a long time of the CO2 was 25 euros a ton. Now that price is 6 or 7, and they don't need to import any more credits for that. And it's because they consume less, or they emit much less today than the allowances they had before. So therefore, I mean, part of that was because there was a cap and trade. So the one that produced electricity or somehow the industry that had the emissions had to pay for those emissions, and somebody else who emitted less captured that price. You had to emit as, say, 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. That was your cap for emissions. So even if you grew in demand. So that's why I say this is a very European view where it works. The cap and trade works, and it's mandatory.
Yeah, Roland?
Yeah, the renewables have a different behavior pattern in a country where oil is the marginal fuel. For instance, in the Dominican Republic, and I think it applies the same for the rest of the Caribbean, where you have very high electricity prices, the spot price alone is an incentive for you to produce wind or solar or whatever. We have been building a wind farm, and we'll have about 95 megawatts in production by October, December of this year. We have 35 now, and the wind itself we're selling it at over 20 cents a kilowatt. So the Dominican Republic has a law where the base price for wind energy is around 13 cents. So you can't go below that. So at the wind regimen that we found in the southwestern Dominican Republic, we're getting somewhere near 38–40% wind availability. The return for such a project is quite significant, and it's quite attractive. That being the case, and if you have, like in Europe, the support price and subsidized price in many cases was 30 euro cents, which is substantially higher than what we would get in the Dominican. But what forces the attractiveness of and even though you may get gas at $15 or $12 or whatever you get it eventually, you still have a support price that makes such a alternative good.
I just want to mention something. The emission of for example, the electricity sector in Brazil emits only 1 or 2% of all the emissions of Brazil. It's not an issue. And why it's not an issue? It's because renewables, as he says, is the natural option. You would go for renewables if you have a nice river with a nice slope and not too much people to displace, or nice wind in the north of Brazil near the coast. It's the natural option. It's much better to build that and then never spend on fuel. So the emission factor is on between 100 and 200 kilos per megawatt hour or whatever for the density of the emissions. It's 1/4 of other places in the world. And as he says, some small countries like Costa Rica, they are happy to have renewables because they don't have to import fuels. They are fuel importers. So they are happy to have all the water they have and some windmills. And in Panama, when we have a new dam or something like that, we are happy we have to import less fuels.
I think that is going to be, I want to thank you. That's the last question. I've got more. If anybody, if we get slow over dinner, we can talk about these. But I think we're going to take a break now. First of all, I want to thank everybody who submitted questions. We got more questions than there was time to ask. I want to thank the panel for your very frank answers. I think they're very useful. And I'm getting a sign from Jeremy that is this, which I think means cocktail hour is about
Happy hour
to begin. Is that right? Okay, good. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah.